The most famous and enduring form of medicinal cannibalism was the use of mumia, or mummy. This term did not simply refer to a corpse, but to a powdered substance derived from desiccated human remains, originally believed to be an ancient Persian remedy made from bitumen, a form of asphalt. However, as European trade expanded and interpretations shifted, the substance used became the ground-up flesh of ancient Egyptian mummies, the allure of the pharaoh's dust. For centuries, especially from the 12th to the 17th century, mumia was one of the most highly sought-after and expensive items in a European apothecary. It was considered a panacea, a cure-all for virtually any ailment, from headaches and internal bleeding to epilepsy and even the plague. The perceived medicinal power stemmed from several intertwined beliefs. Sympathetic magic, the idea that like cures like, or that an enduring, preserved substance, the mummy, could impart its qualities, strength, permanence, and life-extending power to the living. The spirit of the dead. Many believe that consuming the remains transferred the vital spirit or life essence of the deceased into the patient, particularly if the body had been violently or suddenly killed, leaving the spirit trapped and more potent. Exoticism and antiquity, the fact that the most prized source of mumia was thousands of years old, exotic, and associated with the great pharaohs of Egypt, lent it an air of unrivaled mystique and power that justified its high cost. From Egyptian tombs to colonial shelves. While the practice peaked in the 16th and 17th century Europe, it certainly extended into the 18th century and colonial America. European settlers arriving in places like Virginia and Massachusetts relied heavily on the medical knowledge and materials of their homeland. Physicians and apothecaries in the colonies, often practicing medicine based on the same pharmacopoeias used in London, would have stocked and prescribed mumia. Though direct evidence of an active, widespread mummy trade originating in the colonies is limited, the consumption of the product itself was a continuation of a transatlantic medical tradition. Settlers imported many of their most valuable drugs, and the exotic and expensive nature of mumia ensured it would be among the prescribed, if costly, remedies available to the colonial elite. The king's drops and the skull tread. Beyond the ground-up mummies, other human body parts were deemed highly therapeutic, particularly the human skull. This practice gained enormous prestige due to its association with King Charles II of England, 1630 to 1685. Aqua vitae from the cranium. King Charles II was a devoted amateur chemist who regularly used and promoted a specific concoction known as the King's Drops, or Goddard's Drops, named after his personal physician, Jonathan Goddard. The secret ingredient at the heart of this elixir? Powdered human skull. This grim medicine was distilled with alcohol and ammoniac salts and believed to be a potent cure for neurological disorders, epilepsy, apoplexy, dizziness, and fainting spells. Again, the principle of sympathetic magic, using the part of the body to cure ailments of that same part, was at play. Fevers and general weakness. It was often mixed with wine or chocolate and consumed regularly by the king and his courtiers. The king's personal endorsement cemented the skull's place in the medical armory. The grim economics of supply. The demand for human skulls and other body parts was insatiable. This created a macabre yet efficient supply chain that fueled the medicinal trade. Executioners. In Europe, executioners became an unexpected part of the medical supply chain, selling the fresh blood and bodies of executed criminals directly from the scaffold. The blood of a healthy, violently killed individual was considered especially potent, believed to contain the soul's essence at its strongest. Gravediggers and resurrectionists. To meet the demand for bones and skulls, gravediggers and resurrectionists, body snatchers, robbed freshly buried corpses, with the remains often ground down to create spirit of skull or various powders and tinctures. Irish burial sites. Skulls from Irish burial grounds were specifically targeted by some English dealers, adding a layer of colonial exploitation to the already morbid trade. Persistence in colonial America. The king's drops and skull-based remedies were well known throughout the British world. In colonial America, where medicine was primitive and fear of death was omnipresent, apothecaries and physicians prescribed these imported, high-status cures. Even as late as the early 20th century in the United States, remedies containing ground-up human skull were occasionally listed in pharmacopoeias for treating neurological conditions, a chilling testament to the tradition's tenacity, long after other corpse medicines had faded. Other vile remedies: blood, fat, and moss. The scope of medicinal cannibalism extended beyond just mummies and skulls, incorporating a wider array of human tissues, each with its own specific therapeutic application rooted in the belief in the vital spirit, a non-material force connecting the body and soul. The power of fresh blood. Blood, believed to be the primary carrier of the vital spirit, was considered an exceptionally potent elixir. The freshest, hottest blood was thought to be the most robust. The cure for epilepsy. One particularly grotesque treatment involved the immediate consumption of fresh, warm blood from the recently deceased, often administered directly at the site of execution, as a purported cure for epilepsy. For wounds and bleeding, dried and powdered blood was recommended for nosebleeds or applied topically to wounds to stop bleeding, another example of sympathetic magic in action. Human fat and bone. The use of human fat and bone also had its proponents. Human fat. This was often rendered into an ointment or plaster and rubbed externally on the skin to ease the pains of gout and arthritis, or taken internally in a powdered form to help with internal bruising or bleeding. Moss of the skull, or usnea. Even the moss, specifically usnea, that occasionally grew on an unearthed human skull was prized. Its powder was believed to cure nosebleeds and possibly epilepsy, demonstrating how far the reverence for the remains extended. The paradox of European savagery. The history of medicinal cannibalism reveals a profound paradox that underscores the complex, often hypocritical worldview of the early modern European and colonial American. The slur of savagery. During the same era when European explorers and colonists were settling the Americas, they were simultaneously using the accusation of cannibalism as a primary justification for colonizing and subjugating indigenous populations. Terms like savage and incivilized were applied to Native American tribes who practiced forms of ritual cannibalism, whether for spiritual, martial, or sometimes medicinal, such as ingesting the bones of a deceased chief to absorb his wisdom. Yet while condemning the savagery of the New World, these European colonists were actively engaged in their own form of cannibalism, one that was highly commercialized and socially sanctioned. And unequal consumption. The distinction, as historians have noted, lay in who was being consumed. Indigenous cannibalism often involved the consumption of enemies or kin, mortuary cannibalism, in a spiritual or ceremonial context to absorb power or honor the dead. European colonial medicinal cannibalism almost universally relied on consuming the other, the marginalized, the criminal, the foreign. The raw materials came from executed criminals, the poor, and ancient exotic Egyptian tombs. This commodification of the dead was a reflection of the deep social and racial inequalities of the era, where the bodies of the oppressed became resources for the privileged. The decline of corpse medicine. While pervasive for centuries, the practice of medicinal cannibalism slowly began to fade, a process that accelerated from the late 18th century onward. Several factors contributed to its eventual, though gradual, disappearance. The Enlightenment and scientific rationalism. The rise of new scientific methods and Enlightenment thinking challenged many long-held beliefs rooted in sympathetic magic and mystical vitalism. As new understandings of human anatomy and disease emerged, physicians began to demand evidence and rational mechanisms of action, making the consumption of human remains increasingly difficult to justify. Exposure of fraud and counterfeiting. The enormous demand for mumia led to a rampant trade in counterfeit remains. Crooked traders often substituted real mummies with the ground-up bodies of recently dead criminals, beggars, or even animals, sometimes just a smoke-dried carcass disguised as authentic mummy powder. This widespread fraud slowly eroded the public and medical community's faith in the authenticity and efficacy of the remedies, changing social mores. The Victorians in particular adopted a far more reverent and protective view of the dead body, seeing the corpse as an object of solemnity and a container for the soul's memory, not a medical resource. By the 19th century, with the dawn of modern chemistry and the early development of germ theory, the macabre pharmacy of the colonial era was largely abandoned. The corpse elixir, once a prized cure for kings and commoners alike, was relegated to the dustbin of history, a grim, powerful reminder of a time when the line between medicine and magic, civilization and savagery was disturbingly blurred.